The colossal head, a shaggy universe of matted fur and ancient dust, lifted from the Montana prairie grass with the slow gravity of a rising continent. His name was Chief, and he was the undisputed king of the Yellowstone Preserve's northern range, a 2,000-pound titan of muscle and memory, who carried the wildness of the American West in his very bones. But for the past year, the park rangers and wildlife biologists who monitored him had watched a disturbing change come over. The magnificent bison. The calm, almost regal indifference he once showed toward the observation teams had been replaced by a deep, simmering aggression. He would charge at maintenance vehicles without provocation, his massive horns gouging deep wounds into steel doors. He would stand for hours at the edge of his territory, a solitary silhouette against the vast sky, his breath pluming in the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. Dr. Anya Sharma, the preserve's lead wildlife biologist, lowered her binoculars and made another note on her tablet, her brow furrowed with a concern that had become chronic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Subject's isolationist behavior continues to intensify, she dictated into her audio log. Increased territorial displays, heightened aggression towards human presence. He's losing weight despite the abundance of forage. It's as if he's grieving. But what could a bison possibly have to grieve with such ferocity? The younger rangers had a simpler explanation. He's just old and mean, a summer intern had remarked weeks earlier, a comment that had earned him a sharp glare from Dr. Sharma. But she couldn't deny the danger. 2 senior rangers had been forced to scramble up a rock face to escape a sudden, unprovoked charge just last month. The park's administrative board was getting nervous. Whispers of containment protocols and relocation to a more secure facility had begun to circulate, euphemisms for a fate that would effectively be a prison sentence for an animal that had only ever known the boundless freedom of the preserve. What none of them knew, what no scientific paper or behavioral chart could explain, was that Chief's rage was not born of malice, but of a profound and unshakable loyalty. His grief was real, a hollow ache that echoed the vast emptiness of the plains around him. He was waiting. And the man he was waiting for was dying 100 miles away, in a small, sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and regret. Arthur Miller, at 73, was a landscape of faded memories. His hands, once strong enough to mend any fence and gentle enough to calm any frightened calf, now trembled as he reached for a glass of water. A lifetime spent under the vast Montana sky had been reduced to the 4 white walls of a hospice care facility, the result of a heart that had finally decided to betray him after decades of faithful service. Arthur had been the head ranger of the Yellowstone Preserve for 40 years, a legend among his peers. He knew the land not as a park, but as a living entity, its moods and secrets as familiar to him as the lines on his own face. And he had known Chief since the day the bison was born, an orphaned calf found shivering beside his dead mother after a brutal spring blizzard. Against park protocol and the advice of his superiors, Arthur had taken the calf in, hand-rearing him in a special enclosure behind the ranger station. He had named him Chief, not as a joke, but as a promise. "You're going to be the king of this whole place one day," he'd whisper, feeding the gangly creature from a bottle. The bond they formed was something that defied explanation. As Chief grew, he was gradually reintroduced into the wild herd, but he never forgot the man who had saved him. For decades, Arthur's old blue pickup truck was the only vehicle Chief would allow near him. The ranger would drive out to the northern range, park under a familiar cottonwood tree, and wait. And Chief would emerge from the herd, a 2,000-pound animal approaching with the gentle trust of a house pet, his massive head lowering for the familiar scratch behind his ears that only Arthur was allowed to give. Their silent meetings had been the anchor of Arthur's life, a ritual that connected him to the wild heart of the world he had sworn to protect. Then, A year ago, his heart had failed. A triple bypass had left him too weak to continue his work, and he had been forced into a sudden, gut-wrenching retirement. He had left the preserve without a proper goodbye, a quiet departure that felt like a betrayal. His last memory of Chief was of the bison watching from a distant ridge as Arthur's daughter drove him away from the ranger station for the last time. Now lying in his bed, Arthur was haunted by the stories his daughter, Sarah, would tell him after her visits with her old friends at the preserve. "They're saying Chief has become dangerous, Dad," she had told him last week, her voice soft with worry. "They don't understand him. They think he's just another wild animal." Arthur knew better. He knew that Chief wasn't mean. He was heartbroken. The bison was acting out the same sense of abandonment and confusion that echoed in the silent chambers of Arthur's own failing heart. "I have to see him," Arthur said one morning, his voice a reedy whisper that nonetheless carried the weight of an unbreakable resolve. Sarah looked at her father, his body frail but his eyes burning with a familiar intensity. "Dad, the doctor said you can't travel. It's too risky." "The riskiest thing I can do is die in this room without seeing my friend one last time," Arthur insisted. "He thinks I abandoned him, Sarah. I can't let him believe that. Not after everything." He knew he was asking the impossible, a journey into the heart of a wilderness his body was no longer equipped to handle, to see an animal that was now officially classified as a danger to humans. But as he looked out the window at the manicured lawn of the hospice, he could see only the rolling plains of Yellowstone and the silhouette of a lonely king waiting for his friend to come home. Have you ever known a bond that defied logic and explanation? A connection with an animal that felt as deep as any human relationship? Sometimes the most powerful stories are not written in words, but in the silent language of loyalty and love that transcends species. The fight to get Arthur Miller back to Yellowstone was almost as taxing as his failing heart. It took weeks of phone calls, signed waivers, and Sarah's relentless advocacy, pleading with both doctors and park officials. Dr. Sharma was initially hesitant, her professional obligations warring with the deep curiosity Arthur's story had sparked. The official reports painted a picture of a volatile, unpredictable animal. But Arthur's personal history, detailed in old park journals, Sarah had unearthed, told a different story, one of a profound interspecies bond that had been the stuff of legend among the older generation of rangers. "This is highly irregular, Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Sharma had said to Sarah over the phone, the static crackling like a cautious warning. "Bringing a medically fragile civilian into close proximity with a Class 1 animal, especially one exhibiting such erratic behavior, goes against every regulation in the book." But Sarah had inherited her father's quiet determination. "Dr. Sharma, my father believes he is the cause of that erratic behavior. He believes Chief is suffering because he thinks he was abandoned. If there is even a small chance that he's right, that their reunion could calm the animal and solve the problem your team is facing, isn't it a risk worth taking? What's the alternative? A cage? My father says that would destroy him." The argument struck a chord. The prospect of caging an animal as magnificent as Chief was a thought that kept Anya Sharma up at night. It felt like a failure, a surrender to a mystery she couldn't solve. Reluctantly she agreed, but with a list of conditions that was a mile long. Arthur would have to be accompanied by a paramedic. The visit would be limited to 30 minutes, and he would not be allowed to exit the vehicle. A heavy-duty park ranger truck, the kind with reinforced doors and shatterproof windows, would be used for the transport. Arthur, dressed in his old ranger uniform that now hung loosely on his frail frame, felt a surge of life he hadn't experienced in over a year as Sarah drove him toward the preserve's northern gate. The familiar scent of pine and sagebrush filled the air, a perfume of home that no hospital room could ever replicate. He held a small, worn leather pouch in his lap, its contents a secret he had kept for this very moment. As they drove deeper into the preserve, escorted by Dr. Sharma in a separate vehicle, a call came over the ranger radio. "Anya, it's Mark. We've got eyes on Chief. He's about a half-mile from the rendezvous point at Boulder Creek, and he is not in a good mood. He just treated a survey drone. The board is going to love that." Anya's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Just keep your distance, Mark. We're 10 minutes out. The plan is to park the primary vehicle 50 yards from his. Position and wait. No one approaches on foot. Understood?" "Understood," the voice crackled back, laced with skepticism. Good luck with that. When they arrived, the scene was tense. Chief was standing in the middle of a wide clearing, his massive form a study in contained fury. His head was low, and he was pawing at the earth, sending clumps of dirt flying into the air. He was a fortress of muscle and anger, a clear and present danger to anyone who dared enter his domain. The paramedic accompanying Arthur checked his vitals, his expression grim. "His heart rate is already elevated. We need to be careful." Arthur barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the magnificent creature he had raised from a calf. He could see the pain beneath the rage, the confusion behind the aggression. This wasn't the Chief he knew. This was an animal screaming its loneliness to a world that had forgotten how to listen. "Get me closer," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy. "That was the deal, Dad," Sarah said gently. "We stay here. It's safe." "He can't see me properly from here," Arthur insisted. "He just sees another truck, another threat. I need him to see me." He looked at Dr. Sharma, who had approached their vehicle, her face a mask of professional concern. "Doctor, I know you think I'm just a sentimental old fool, but I know that animal better than anyone on this planet. He's not going to hurt me. He's hurting because of me. If this incredible story of a lifelong bond is touching your heart, we'd be so grateful if you could hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to share more amazing stories of connection and loyalty. Now let's see what happens in this impossible reunion." Something in Arthur's quiet certainty, the unwavering conviction in his tired eyes, made Dr. Sharma reconsider. She looked at the bison, a magnificent problem she had no solution for. She looked at the old man, a relic from a different era of park management, a time when intuition was valued as much as data. Against her better judgment, she nodded to the ranger driving Arthur's truck. "Okay, Miller, take it slow. 10 yards closer. The moment he makes a move, you back out. Fast." The heavy truck lurched forward, crawling over the uneven ground. Chief's head snapped up, his dark eyes fixing on the approaching vehicle. A low grunt, like the rumbling of distant thunder, emanated from his chest. He took a step forward, lowering his horns. Inside the truck, the paramedic put his hand on Arthur's shoulder. "That's it. We're done." But Arthur was already fumbling with the window controls. No, not yet. The electric hum of the window descending was shockingly loud in the tense silence. Cool, crisp mountain air filled the cab, carrying with it the scent of the wild and the raw, earthy smell of the agitated bison. What is he doing? Dr. Sharma breathed into her radio, watching from her position 50 yards back. "Tell them to get that window up now." "Arthur, no!" Sarah pleaded. But Arthur leaned his head out into the open air, the wind catching his thin, white hair. He ignored the frantic calls from the paramedic, the fear in his daughter's eyes. He had only one focus, one audience. He lifted his trembling hands to his mouth, and from his lips came a sound that no one on the team had ever heard before. It was a high-pitched, three-note whistle, a unique bird-like call that was both strange and beautiful. It was the same call he had used to summon Chief from the herd for over 30 years. It was their secret language, a sound that meant safety, friendship, and home. The effect on the bison was instantaneous and profound. Chief, who had been tensed for a charge, froze mid-step. His massive head, which had been lowered in aggression, lifted slowly. His ears swiveled, trying to pinpoint the source of a sound that was buried deep in his oldest memories. He grunted again, but this time it was different. The aggressive edge was gone, replaced by a note of confusion, of questioning. Arthur whistled again, louder this time, the clear notes cutting through the tension. He then reached into the worn leather pouch he'd been clutching and pulled out a dried, wrinkled apple, the last one from the old tree behind the ranger station, which he had saved for over a year. He held it out the open window, his hand shaking. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "It's me, Chief," Arthur called out, his voice weak but clear. "I'm here, old friend. I came back." And that's when it happened. A sound so unexpected, so biologically improbable, that Dr. Anya Sharma would spend the rest of her career trying to explain it. From the chest of the 2,000-pound bison, a creature known for its deep, guttural grunts, came a new sound. It was a soft, lowing vocalization, a gentle, almost mournful moo that sounded shockingly like the call of a domestic cow. It was the sound he had made as an orphaned calf when Arthur would bring him his bottle of milk. It was a sound of recognition, of relief, of a long-held grief finally finding its voice. The king was calling out to his friend, and the language he chose was the language of their shared past. Chief took a tentative step forward, then another. The aggression melted away from his frame like snow in the spring sun. His posture softened, the tension in his massive shoulders easing for the first time in a year. He was no longer a dangerous animal. He was a friend, walking slowly, deliberately, toward the man he thought he had lost forever. Have you ever witnessed a moment that defied all scientific explanation? A moment of pure connection that made you question everything you thought you knew? Sometimes the deepest truths are not found in textbooks, but in the incredible unwritten language of the heart. The silence that fell over the clearing was absolute, broken only by the soft, mournful lowing of the bison and the quiet sobs of Arthur's daughter. Every ranger on the radio, every member of Dr. Sharma's team, watched in stunned disbelief as the most dangerous animal in the preserve transformed before their very eyes. The 2,000-pound wall of fury had dissolved, revealing the lonely soul within. Chief approached the truck not with the caution of a wild animal, but with the steady, unwavering purpose of a friend. He stopped just feet from the open window, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on Arthur. All the anger was gone, replaced by a look of such profound recognition and sadness that it felt almost human. He was so close now that Arthur could see the individual strands of gray in the thick fur around his muzzle, could smell the familiar earthy scent that he had missed more than he could ever put into words. "He's beautiful," Arthur whispered, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks, and mingling with the lines that a lifetime of laughter and sorrow had carved there. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, Chief extended his massive head toward the window. He ignored the dried apple in Arthur's outstretched hand, his focus entirely on the man himself. He nudged Arthur's trembling hand with his wet nose, a gesture so familiar it shattered the last of Arthur's composure. "I'm so sorry, boy," Arthur wept, his voice thick with emotion. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Never meant to leave you. I got old. I got sick. I'm so sorry." The bison responded by pushing his head more firmly against Arthur's hand. Then he did something else that defied all expectation. He began to lick Arthur's hand, his huge, rough tongue sweeping over the old man's skin in the same way he had as a calf. It was a gesture of affection, of forgiveness, a silent communication that said everything words could not. Dr. Sharma stood by her vehicle, her scientific mind struggling to process the scene. She was witnessing a clear, documented case of cross-species emotional recognition and reconciliation. The vocalizations, the gentle approach, the tactile gestures of affection. It was a data set of pure, unadulterated love. She raised her camera, not the one for scientific documentation, but her personal phone, and began to record, knowing that this was a moment the world needed to see. "Dad, the paramedic says your blood pressure is stabilizing," Sarah said her voice choked with tears. "It's actually lower than it was this morning." Arthur chuckled, a wet, broken sound. "He's the best medicine I could ask for." He turned his head and looked at Sarah, then at the concerned paramedic. "Please," he begged, his voice finding a new strength. "Let me get out, just for a minute. I need to stand with him one more time." "Absolutely not," the paramedic said instantly. "It's too dangerous. His heart can't take the strain." "But Dr." Sharma, emboldened by the miracle she was witnessing, intervened. She walked over to the truck, her eyes never leaving the now peaceful Bison. "Let him," she said, her voice firm with a newfound conviction. "This isn't a moment of stress. This is a moment of healing for both of them. We'll be right here. We'll help him." And so, with the cautious help of his daughter and the paramedic, Arthur Miller slowly, carefully, swung his frail legs out of the truck and placed his feet on the sacred ground of his former home. He stood, unsteady but resolute, leaning heavily on Sarah for support. Chief watched the whole process with patient intelligence. He took a small step back, as if to give Arthur space, but his eyes never wavered. The moment Arthur was standing, the massive Bison closed the distance between them, stopping just inches from his old friend. Arthur reached out a trembling hand and placed it flat against Chief's shaggy cheek. The fur was thick and coarse, alive with the warmth of the sun and the steady, powerful pulse of life beneath. The sheer scale of the animal was overwhelming. Arthur's head barely reached the Bison's shoulder. He was a fragile, fading man standing beside a monument of wild, untamed power. Yet in that moment, they were not man and beast. They were equals. Two old friends reunited at the end of their days, their shared history a silent, unbreakable bond between them. "Look at you," Arthur murmured, his hand stroking the familiar rough fur. "You're still the king." Chief closed his eyes and leaned into Arthur's touch, a 2,000-pound animal finding comfort in the presence of the human who had been the one constant in his long life. He stood perfectly still, allowing the frail old man to connect with him, a display of trust so absolute it felt like a sacred gift. The other rangers had started to emerge from their vehicles, drawn by the impossible scene. They stood at a respectful distance, their hardened professional exteriors cracking as they watched their legendary former boss in his final poignant reunion. They were witnessing the closing of a circle, the end of an era, a story that would be told around park campfires for generations to come. For 10 minutes, they stood together under the vast Montana sky. Arthur spoke to Chief in a low, quiet voice, telling him about the hospice, about his dreams of the prairie, about how proud he was of the magnificent animal he had become. And Chief listened, his calm presence a silent answer, a balm to the old man's wounded soul. When it was time to go, the separation was a quiet, sorrowful affair. "I have to leave now, boy," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "But I'm not abandoning you. Not this time. I'll be watching over you. Always." As Arthur was helped back into the truck, Chief didn't rampage or roar. He simply watched, his gaze soft and knowing. And as the truck pulled away, he lifted his head and let out one more soft, lowing moo. It wasn't a call of distress, but a farewell. A goodbye from one old friend to another. Do you believe that animals have the capacity for deep emotional memory and forgiveness? The bond between Arthur and Chief suggests a level of consciousness and connection that science is only just beginning to understand. Share your own stories of unforgettable animal bonds in the comments below. The journey back from Yellowstone was profoundly different from the journey there. A sense of peace had settled over Arthur Miller, a tranquility that seemed to emanate from him and fill the entire vehicle. He was quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, but his eyes were no longer haunted. He had done what he had set out to do. He had kept his promise. He had said goodbye. Back at the preserve, Dr. Anya Sharma was dealing with the incredible aftermath. The video she had taken on her phone, which she had shared with a trusted colleague, had, through a series of rapid-fire forwards, found its way to a local news affiliate. The story of the dying ranger and the grieving bison was simply too powerful to contain. By the time Arthur was back in his hospice room, the story was beginning to go viral. The news station had overlaid her raw footage with interviews with retired rangers who tearfully recounted the legend of Arthur and Chief, creating a narrative of love, loyalty, and a bond that transcended death. The park's administrative board, which had been on the verge of condemning Chief as a dangerous liability, was now flooded with calls and emails from people all over the world, expressing their awe and demanding that the animal be protected at all costs. The dangerous bison had become a global symbol of love and fidelity overnight. Dr. Sharma found herself in a series of emergency meetings, but instead of discussing containment protocols, they were now discussing the creation of the Miller Chief Legacy Program, an initiative to fund further research into animal consciousness and emotion. Her report on the incident became a landmark paper. She described the immediate and sustained de-escalation of aggressive behaviors in the subject, following auditory and visual recognition of a specific human companion. She documented the anomalous bovine vocalizations and the clear tactile displays of affection. Scientifically, it was groundbreaking. Personally, it had changed the way she saw the world. But the most significant change was in Chief himself. In the days and weeks following Arthur's visit, the bison's transformation was total and sustained. He ceased all aggressive behavior. He began to graze peacefully, his movements relaxed and fluid. He allowed the ranger trucks to pass without a second glance. The angry, grieving king was gone, and in his place was the calm, regal monarch the old-timers remembered. It was as if Arthur's visit had given him the one thing he needed: permission to let go of his anger. He understood. He had not been abandoned. His friend had simply moved on to the next great wilderness. Arthur Miller passed away peacefully in his sleep 1 week after his visit to Yellowstone. His daughter Sarah was by his side. His last words, whispered in a dream, were, "Chief is waiting." Sarah, honoring her father's wishes, had him cremated, and in a private ceremony attended by Dr. Sharma and a handful of old rangers, she scattered his ashes from the top of Boulder Creek, the same clearing where the reunion had taken place. As she watched the ashes catch on the wind and spread across the vast, sun-drenched prairie, she saw a familiar figure emerge from a thicket of aspen trees. It was Chief. The bison walked to the center of the clearing and stood for a long time, his head raised as if tasting the wind, a silent, solitary guardian standing watch over his friend's final resting place. The legacy of their bond grew. The preserve officially named the northern range the Miller Range in Arthur's honor. Dr. Sharma's research, funded by the new Legacy Program, led to revolutionary new protocols for managing wildlife. Protocols that were based on understanding individual animal histories and emotional needs, rather than just species-wide behaviors. She proved, through Chief's continued peaceful existence, that many problem animals were not problems at all, but individuals responding to loss, fear, or grief in the only ways they knew how. The story inspired a generation of new wildlife biologists and conservationists. People from all over the world made pilgrimages to Yellowstone, not just to see the geysers and canyons, but to catch a glimpse of the legendary bison who had taught the world a profound lesson about love. Tourists would watch him from a distance, a magnificent living monument to a friendship that had become a modern myth. Years later, an elderly Dr. Sharma would bring her own grandchildren to Boulder Creek and tell them the story. She would point to the magnificent bison, now old and gray but still majestic, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Animals feel more than we can ever know," she would tell them. "They feel loyalty, they feel joy, they feel grief. And sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, they teach you how to feel too." Sheaf lived a long and peaceful life, the undisputed and respected king of his domain until the very end. He was never aggressive again. He became a gentle, calming presence in the herd, a wise old patriarch. But rangers often noted a peculiar habit. Every so often, especially on clear, quiet mornings, he would leave the herd and walk to the clearing at Boulder Creek. He would stand there for an hour or more, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if listening for a familiar whistle on the wind. His story, and Arthur's, became a powerful reminder that we are all connected in ways we may not understand, that love is the most powerful force in the universe, and that a life of kindness creates echoes that will ripple through the world long after we are gone. It proved that one man's compassion could soothe the wildest heart, and that one animal's loyalty could inspire the entire world. What do you believe is the greatest lesson animals can teach us? The story of Arthur and Sheaf reminds us that the bonds we form can create a legacy of love and understanding that lasts forever, proving that the most profound connections are often the ones that have no need for words. 5 years had passed since Arthur Miller's ashes had been given to the Montana wind. 5 years since Sheaf had stood his solitary watch over the soul of his departed friend. The Miller Range had become a living testament to their story, a sanctuary not just for wildlife, but for a more compassionate ideal of conservation. Dr. Anya Sharma, now the Director of Wildlife Management for the entire preserve, had ensured Arthur's legacy was woven into the very fabric of the park's philosophy. Her research, born from that miraculous reunion at Boulder Creek, had revolutionized her field. She had proven, through meticulous observation and data that even the most hardened skeptics couldn't refute, that animal herds were not just collections of instinct-driven creatures, but complex societies with leaders, teachers, and intricate social bonds. And Sheaf, in his venerable old age, was her exhibit of a magnificent bison, his horns now worn smooth with time and his shaggy coat peppered with distinguished gray, was the undisputed patriarch of the northern herds. He moved with a calm, deliberate wisdom, a gentle giant who commanded respect not through aggression, but through a quiet authority that seemed to emanate from him. The younger bison watched him, learned from him. He would guide them away from patches of weak ice in the winter and lead them to hidden springs during the dry heat of summer. He was, in every sense of the word, a king. The aggression that had once defined him was a distant memory, a story told to new rangers to teach them the profound impact of empathy. The peace in the Miller Range felt as ancient and as permanent as the mountains that framed it. But permanence is an illusion. The threat, when it came, arrived not with the fury of a blizzard or the crackle of a wildfire, but in the polished leather shoes and crisp suit of a man named Marcus Reynolds. Reynolds was the new park superintendent, appointed by a budget-conscious committee in Washington, D.C. He was a man who saw the world through the lens of a spreadsheet, a man for whom terms like efficiency, risk mitigation, and data optimization were not just buzzwords, but a creed. He had a reputation for streamlining operations and cutting what he deemed sentimental redundancies. On his first tour of the preserve, he listened to Anya's passionate explanation of the Miller Chief Legacy Program with a thin, dismissive smile. "Dr. Sharma, this is all very touching," he said, his voice smooth and detached as they stood on an overlook, watching Chief's herd graze peacefully below. "A wonderful story. But we are managing a multi-million-dollar federal resource, not a petting zoo. Anecdotes, no matter how heartwarming, are not a sound basis for policy." Anya felt a cold dread creep into her heart. "With all due respect, Director," she countered, keeping her voice steady, My policies are based on 5 years of peer-reviewed research demonstrating that this compassionate approach has reduced negative human-animal encounters by 80% and has improved herd health significantly. The anecdote you're referring to was the catalyst for the most successful and cost-effective management strategy this park has ever seen. Reynolds was unmoved. The past is the past. My mandate is to modernize, to bring Yellowstone into the 21st century. And that begins with a comprehensive bio-tracking initiative. Full herd census, health diagnostics, and real-time GPS monitoring. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Every bison in this preserve is to be tranquilized, examined, and fitted with a GPS ear tag and a subcutaneous data chip. No exceptions. The blood drained from Anya's face. Director, you can't. To dart an animal like Chief, an elderly patriarch who has a deep-seated history of trauma related to human betrayal. It would be a profound violation. The stress alone could kill him. And it would shatter the trust we've spent years building with these herds. It would undo everything Arthur Miller stood for. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. Arthur Miller was a ranger. He was not a saint. We cannot allow the ghost of one employee to dictate park policy indefinitely. The collaring program will begin in 1 month, starting with the northern herds. That's an order, Doctor. As he walked away, leaving Anya standing alone on the overlook, she felt a profound sense of failure. A new battle for the soul of Yellowstone had begun, and she was standing on the front line, defending the memory of a gentle old man against a new kind of monster, one who wore a suit and wielded a budget as his weapon. She looked down at Chief, who had just nudged a young calf away from a steep embankment with a gentle push of his massive head. He was teaching, leading, living out the peaceful legacy Arthur had died to protect. And Anya knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would have to fight for him all over again. Had the world truly moved on so fast? Had the profound lesson of that day at Boulder Creek been so easily forgotten, so quickly? Dismissed as a quaint old story? The coming weeks were a tense, frustrating battle of wills. Anya prepared a new report, a 50-page document filled with biometric data, stress hormone analysis, and behavioral charts, all arguing for a non-invasive exception for Chief and his immediate herd. She highlighted his advanced age, his documented history, and the potential for a catastrophic stress-induced cardiac event. She presented it to Reynolds in his new sterile office, a room that still smelled of fresh paint and ambition. He glanced at the executive summary for less than a minute before pushing it back across the desk. Doctor, your passion is admirable, but your perspective is compromised, he stated flatly. You're too close to the subject. This program is about standardizing procedures. An exception for one animal creates a precedent that undermines the entire system. What if every researcher had a special animal? We'd have chaos. What we have now is peace, Anya shot back, her professional composure beginning to fray. Peace built on trust. You're proposing we go back to the days of fear and force. It's a regression, not an advancement. It's control, Reynolds corrected her, and control is safety. The helicopter and darting teams are scheduled for the 1st of October. I suggest you prepare your staff. The morale among the park staff plummeted. The older rangers, men and women who had worked under Arthur, were openly mutinous, muttering darkly in the break rooms. The younger ones, like Ben Carter, a sharp, ambitious ranger who had joined the service 3 years ago, were caught in the middle. Ben had grown up hearing the legend of Arthur and Chief. It was one of the reasons he'd wanted to work at Yellowstone. But he was also a new employee in a precarious field, eager to make a good impression on the new superintendent. Anya, what are we supposed to do? He asked her one afternoon, catching her as she was leaving the research center. Director Reynolds is talking about insubordination. People are worried about their jobs. And I'm worried about the life of an animal who is the living soul of this park, Anya said, her voice weary. Sometimes you have to decide what you're willing to risk your job for, Ben. Arthur Miller risked everything for what he believed in. That's why we have a legacy to protect. She spent every spare moment she could out in the Miller Range, observing. Chief, as if trying to memorize his peaceful existence before it was shattered. The old Bison seemed oblivious to the bureaucratic war being waged in his name. His days were a calm rhythm of grazing, sleeping, and wisely governing his herd. One crisp September afternoon, Anya and Ben were observing from a ridge when a small drama unfolded below. A lone wolf, opportunistic and bold, had managed to separate a young, inexperienced female bison from the main herd. The young bison panicked, running blindly along a game trail that led towards a treacherous rocky canyon. The wolf gave chase, nipping at her heels. Before the rangers could even debate intervention, Chief acted. He didn't charge the wolf with blind fury. Instead, he let out a deep, resonant bellow that got the attention of two of his strongest bulls. Then, in a display of what Anya could only describe as tactical brilliance, he moved. He didn't run towards the wolf, but took a wide, intercepting angle, using his immense body to cut off the wolf's path to the canyon. The two younger bulls, following his lead, fanned out, effectively herding the panicked female away from the danger and back towards the safety of the herd. The wolf, outmaneuvered and facing three formidable opponents, gave up the hunt and slunk back into the trees. It was over in minutes. There was no violence, only a calm, intelligent, and perfectly executed strategy. Did you see that? Ben breathed, his binoculars still trained on the scene. He didn't just chase it off. He outthought it. He used the terrain. He directed his bulls like a field general. I see it every day, Ben, Anya said quietly. This is what Reynolds calls an anecdote. It's the kind of wisdom you can't quantify on a spreadsheet. It's the kind of intelligence that deserves our respect, not our violation. Ben lowered his binoculars, a look of resolve hardening his young face. What can I do to help? He asked. The plan they devised was a long shot, a desperate gamble. With Ben's help, Anya began a quiet campaign, not of insubordination, but of information. They distributed her report, not just to park staff, but to a network of influential conservationists, retired park officials, and journalists who had covered the original story. They attached the new video of Chief outsmarting the wolf. The goal was to create a groundswell of public and professional pressure, to show Reynolds that his modernization was seen by the outside world as a callous and ignorant desecration of a beloved American icon. The story began to gain traction. Articles appeared online with titles like "Yellowstone's New Chief Threatens Its Old One" and data verses. Empathy, the battle for the soul of a national park. The phone in Reynolds' office began to ring with calls from powerful donors and concerned board members. He was furious, suspecting Anya was behind the leak but unable to prove it. Instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride now deeply invested in seeing the collaring program through. He moved the date up. The roundup would happen in 3 days. He's trying to get it done before the story gets too big to control. Anya told Ben, her heart sinking. It felt like they were losing. As the day approached, a somber mood fell over the park. The helicopter arrived, a mechanical predator that seemed to desecrate the sky above the pristine landscape. The darting team, contracted specialists with hardened, unsentimental faces, set up their equipment. It felt like an invasion. Anya spent the last evening before the roundup sitting on the porch of the old ranger station, a place she rarely visited, because it held too many memories of Arthur. She looked out at the darkening mountains and whispered into the wind, "I'm sorry, Arthur, I'm trying, but I don't think it's enough." She felt a tear slide down her cheek, a tear of frustration and fear. She was afraid of what the trauma would do to Chief, but she was also afraid of a world where a story like his and Arthur's could be so easily erased by a man with a clipboard and a budget. The morning of the roundup was cold and unnervingly still. A thick fog clung to the valleys, muffling all sound. It felt, to Anya, like the world was holding its breath. She and Ben drove out to the staging area, not to protest, but to bear witness. Reynolds was already there, directing the operation like a general before a battle, his face set and grim. "Doctor," he said with a curt nod, not bothering to hide his disdain, "I trust you're not here to cause any further trouble. I'm here to observe and document the effects of your protocol on the animals." "Director," Anya replied, her voice cold as ice. The helicopter lifted off, its rotors shattering the morning silence, and ascended into the fog. On the monitors in the mobile command unit, they watched the thermal imaging as the machine began its work, moving to the edge of the Miller Range. The plan was to use the noise and downdraft of the helicopter to push Chief's herd out of the rugged, wooded areas and into the open plains where the darting team waited. At first, the herd reacted as expected. They were startled, confused. The thermal images showed them bunching together, moving nervously away from the terrifying machine in the sky. "See," Reynolds said, a note of triumph in his voice. "Predictable patterns, textbook." But then, something shifted. As the helicopter descended to apply more pressure, Chief did not lead his herd into a panic stampede towards the open plains. Instead, he did something utterly unexpected. He turned his herd and led them deeper into the woods, towards a narrow, winding canyon flanked by steep, rocky cliffs that Anya knew well. It was a treacherous area, difficult for a large herd to navigate, and almost impossible for a helicopter to effectively maneuver in. "What's he doing?" the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "He's not running from us. He's moving with purpose. He's taking them into the devil's backbone." Reynolds leaned closer to the monitor, his confident smirk gone. "Force them out," he commanded. "Don't let them get in there." "Sir, the wind shear in that canyon is unpredictable," the pilot warned. "It's too risky to go in low." Chief, however, seemed to know this. He led his family with a preternatural calm single file through the narrow passages. He was not panicking. He was executing a strategic retreat, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, a knowledge passed down through generations of bison and reinforced by decades of wandering with Arthur to outsmart his pursuers. He was using the wildness of the land itself as his shield. Frustrated, Reynolds ordered the pilot to circle the canyon entrance, to try and head them off if they emerged. But as the helicopter banked sharply, the sudden noise and movement had a terrible, unintended consequence. A young calf, born that spring, broke from the single-file line in terror. It scrambled up a shale-covered slope, away from its mother, its small hooves struggling for purchase. The mother bellowed in distress, but was trapped in the narrow passage by the bison in front of her. The calf, now completely disoriented, slipped and slid, finding itself on a narrow ledge overlooking the sheer 100-foot drop. The helicopter, trying to correct its course, inadvertently moved closer, and its downdraft sent a shower of loose rock and debris down onto the terrified calf. It bleated in pure terror, cornered, and began to slip towards the edge. "Pull up! Pull up now!" Anya screamed at the radio, her heart lodging in her throat. "You're going to push it over the edge." Ben grabbed his own radio, his voice frantic. "Ground team, we have a potential fall at the west face of Devil's Backbone. A calf is on the ledge." From the command unit, they could only watch the horrifying thermal image, a small bright signature, perilously close to disappearing into the cold blue void of the canyon below. The mother's panicked cries echoed over the radio from a mic on a ranger on the ground. It was a disaster, a direct result of Reynolds' aggressive, heartless strategy. In that moment of crisis when machines and protocols had created nothing but chaos, Chief performed his second miracle. He had successfully led the majority of his herd into the relative safety of the canyon's deeper recesses. But when he heard the mother's frantic bellows and the calf's terrified bleats, he stopped. He turned, leaving the safety he had just secured for his family, and trotted back toward the canyon entrance. He emerged onto the slope, placing his immense body between the helicopter and the ledge. He ignored the terrifying machine hovering 100 feet above him. His focus was entirely on the panicked calf. He approached the ledge slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. The calf, seeing him, cried out again, its back legs slipping further over the edge. Sheaf didn't hesitate. He let out a low, gentle rumble, a sound that was not a command but a reassurance. It was a sound Arthur would have recognized. Then, he carefully, painstakingly, made his way onto the treacherous ledge himself. The sight was almost unbearable to watch. The 2,000-pound bull, on a sliver of rock that seemed impossibly small to hold him, reached the terrified calf. He nudged it once, gently, with his massive head. Then he began to moo. A soft, lowing sound, the same impossible sound he had made for Arthur. He was speaking the language of the nursery, the language of absolute safety, to a terrified child. He nudged the calf again, away from the abyss, positioning his own body as a living wall against the fall. Slowly, gently, he guided the calf back along the ledge, his deep moos a constant, calming mantra. He led it off the shale and back onto the solid ground of the game trail, where its frantic mother was now able to reach it. On the monitor, Reynolds stared, his mouth agape. He watched as Chief gave the reunited mother and calf one last gentle nudge before turning to face the helicopter, not with aggression, but with a quiet, defiant dignity. He had not only saved the calf, he had managed a crisis his own way, with wisdom and compassion, succeeding where Reynolds's expensive technology and aggressive tactics had failed catastrophically. A stunned silence filled the command unit. It was Ben's voice that finally broke, it crackling over the radio from his position on the ground. "Director Reynolds," he said, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence, "the calf is safe. Chief, he just rescued it. He managed the situation better than we ever could have." Reynolds stared at the screen, at the thermal image of the massive bull calmly rejoining his herd. He was a man who only believed in data, and he had just been given the most powerful data point of his life. He had witnessed an act of intelligence, courage, and compassion so profound it defied every metric he valued. He lifted his radio to his lips, his hand visibly shaking. "Pilot," he said, his voice humbled and hoarse, "bring the helicopter home. The operation is over. Call it off." Anya closed her eyes, a single tear of profound relief tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Arthur's legacy was safe. The old king, in his infinite wisdom, had saved them all. The retreat from Devil's Backbone was conducted with a quiet reverence that felt more like the conclusion of a sacred ceremony than a failed park operation. The helicopter landed softly, its rotors winding down with a sigh that seemed to echo the collective exhalation of every person present. The darting team, men whose work demanded a professional detachment, packed their tranquilizer guns and equipment. With slow, deliberate movements, their usual hardened expressions replaced by looks of quiet contemplation. They had come to sedate a beast and had instead witnessed a king save his subject. No one spoke to Director Reynolds as he strode from the mobile command unit to his vehicle. His face was an unreadable mask of granite, but his usual aura of crisp, untouchable authority had vanished, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked stillness. He drove away alone, leaving Anya and her team to manage the peaceful dispersal of the ground crews. The Rangers, who just hours before had been divided by loyalty and fear, now worked together seamlessly. They shared thermoses of coffee and spoke in hushed tones, replaying the events they had witnessed. Young Ben Carter's first-hand account had already become the official version, his voice filled with awe, narrating the story of Chief's impossible courage and wisdom. "I've never seen anything like it," An old-timer ranger, a man who had known Arthur Miller for 20 years, said to Ben, clapping him on the shoulder. "Your old boss would have been proud of that bull today. And he would have been proud of all of you who stood up for him." That small praise, connecting him directly to the legacy he admired, meant more to Ben than any official commendation ever could. Anya found Marcus Reynolds 2 hours later. He hadn't returned to his office. Instead, he was in the Preserve's small, underfunded archive room, a place he had previously dismissed as a dusty relic. The room was lined with old maps, faded photographs, and shelves of handwritten journals from rangers long past. He was sitting at a table, a small video monitor. In front of him, watching the footage from the canyon on a loop. The scene of Chief nudging the calf away from the precipice played over and over again. He didn't look up when Anya entered. He just gestured toward the screen with a trembling hand. "Explain it to me, Doctor," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority, leaving only a raw, bewildered curiosity. From a scientific perspective, what was that? Predictive modeling of structural weaknesses in the terrain. An instinctual response to a juvenile distress call. "Give me the data." Anya pulled up a chair and sat beside him, not as an adversary, but as a fellow scientist, observing a phenomenon that transcended their current understanding. "There is no data point for wisdom, Director," she began softly. "There's no metric. For courage, what you're watching isn't an algorithm. It's a choice." He saw the situation, assessed the dangers, the helicopter, the unstable ground, the panicked calf, and he chose to intervene, even at great personal risk. "But how?" Reynolds insisted, finally looking at her. His eyes were wide with a desperate need for a logical framework to contain the miracle he had witnessed. How did he know what to do? The precision of it, the calmness under that much pressure. It wasn't a stampede. It was a strategy. A wild animal doesn't strategize. "He does," Anya corrected him gently, "if he had a good teacher." She stood and walked over to a dusty shelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with the name A. Miller. She opened it to a random page, the paper yellowed and soft with age. Arthur's familiar, neat cursive filled the page. "Observed Chief today, interacting with the new calves," Anya read aloud. "He seems to have a unique way of communicating with them. Not the aggressive posturing of the other bulls, but a low, rumbling sound. He uses it to guide them away from the riverbank when the current is strong. He's not forcing them. He's reassuring them. It's remarkable. He's learned that true strength isn't about dominance, but about protection. I wonder where he picked that up." Anya looked at Reynolds, who was listening with rapt attention. "This journal is filled with hundreds of entries just like this, spanning 30 years. It's a lifetime of observation. What you call an anecdote, Arthur Miller called a conversation. He didn't just study Chief. He learned from him. He respected his intelligence, and in doing so, he fostered it. What you saw today wasn't a random act of instinct. It was the culmination of a 30-year friendship. It was a lesson taught by a human and perfected by a bison." She handed the journal to Reynolds. He took it, his hands tracing the worn leather cover. He flipped through the pages, seeing not just words, but decades of patience, of quiet mornings, of a man and an animal sharing a silent understanding under the vast Montana sky. He saw a different kind of data, a qualitative record of a relationship, so profound it had imprinted itself onto the very genetics of the animal's behavior. "He was teaching him," Reynolds whispered, more to himself than to Anya. "All that time. He was teaching him how to be a king. And how to be a father," Anya added. "Chief didn't just save a calf today. He acted like a parent, the kind of parent Arthur was to him. He was paying a debt of love. That's the part that doesn't fit on a spreadsheet." Reynolds was silent for a long time, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the video monitor playing its loop of impossible grace. He had built his entire career on the belief that anything that couldn't be measured didn't matter. He was a man of charts, graphs, and predictable outcomes. And he had just been proven utterly comprehensively wrong by an old bull, and the ghost of a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. The foundation of his worldview had been shattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, humbled. "I have spent my entire career trying to impose order on the natural world," he said, looking at the journal in his hands. "It appears I should have spent more time trying to understand the order that's already there." He looked up at Anya, and for the first time she saw not a director, but a man seeking guidance. "You were right, Doctor. I was wrong. The collaring program is finished. But that's not enough. Just stopping isn't a solution. Show me what comes next. Show me the better way." The weeks that followed were as transformative for the park's management as the reunion at Boulder Creek had been for Chief. A new partnership was forged, one built on the ashes of Reynolds's failed initiative. It was a collaboration that married Anya's profound, intuitive understanding with Reynolds's formidable talent for logistics and securing funding. Together, they drafted a new master plan for the preserve, a document they officially titled the Yellowstone Interspecies Stewardship Program. Unofficially, everyone in the park called it the Chief's Accord. The accord was revolutionary. It abandoned invasive physical tagging for all but the most extreme medical cases. Instead, with Reynolds championing the budget requests in Washington, they invested millions in a state-of-the-art, non-invasive monitoring system. They purchased a fleet of advanced, near-silent drones capable of high-altitude thermal and photographic observation, a system so unobtrusive the herds never even knew they were being watched. They installed a network of sensitive audio sensors across the range, linked to an AI program that Anya and her team were training to recognize and analyze bison vocalizations, to differentiate between distress calls, territorial warnings, and the soft, reassuring moos of a leader calming his family. The park became a global leader in compassionate conservation, a place where technology was used not to control nature, but to better understand and respect it. The spirit of Arthur Miller's quiet patience was now backed by the power of 21st century data analysis. Reynolds became Anya's greatest advocate, a man converted. He secured grants for her research, championed her work in front of congressional committees, and always deferred to her judgment on matters concerning the well-being of the animals. He had learned the hard way that true strength was not about asserting one's will, but about having the wisdom to listen and the humility to learn. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Anya, Reynolds, and a proud Ben Carter stood on the overlook at Boulder Creek. Ben was holding a tablet linked to the new monitoring system. On the screen, a series of complex data visualizations showed the northern herd's real-time status. Stress hormone indicators, derived from audio analysis, were at an all-time low. Herd cohesion metrics were at an all-time high. The data was clear, irrefutable. The hands-off, respect-based approach was working beyond their wildest dreams. But then they lowered the tablet and simply watched. Below them, in the sun-drenched valley, Chief was resting. He was lying in a patch of new grass, surrounded by his herd. The calf he had saved was nuzzling against its mother nearby, healthy and strong. The entire scene was one of profound, unshakable peace. Reynolds looked at the glowing data on the tablet, then at the magnificent old bull resting in the valley. For the first time, the two images were not in conflict. The data and the reality told the exact same story. "Remarkable," Reynolds said, his voice quiet with an emotion that was no longer confusion, but pure awe. He had finally learned to see the anecdote and the data as one and the same. He had learned to read the story written on the land itself. As they watched, Chief slowly rose to his feet. He stretched his massive frame, took a long look at his peaceful kingdom, and then turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the landscape, until it seemed to settle on the very overlook where they stood. It was probably a coincidence, a trick of the light. But for a fleeting moment, it felt to all three of them as if he was looking right at them. As if he knew they were there, not as intruders, but as guardians. As if he was acknowledging their watchfulness, their respect. It was a silent cross-species nod of approval, a benediction from the king. And in that quiet moment of shared understanding, Arthur Miller's legacy was not just preserved. It was reborn, stronger and more vibrant than ever, a promise kept between the wild heart of a bison, the steadfast soul of a woman, and the humbled mind of a man who had finally learned to listen. The years that followed were a golden era for the preserve, a time of quiet study and profound peace. The chief's accord became the new standard, a model for compassionate conservation studied by parks across the globe. Director Reynolds, fully transformed, became its most eloquent champion, a man who now spoke of animal societies with the passion of a convert. And Chief, the old king, lived out his days in the gentle sunlight of the Miller Range, a living embodiment of the grace he had taught them all. He grew ancient. His movements became slower, more deliberate, each step seemingly weighted with the memory of 1,000 seasons. His great, shaggy head was now more gray than brown, and his eyes held the deep, placid wisdom of a mountain that has seen all things. The herd's dynamics shifted around him in a slow, respectful ballet. The younger, stronger bulls, some of whom he had mentored and even saved, now flanked him as he moved, a voluntary honor guard. They would stand watch while he slept, their bodies forming a living wall against the world, repaying the debt of his long and gentle reign. He was no longer just their leader. He was their history, their sacred elder. Then came the autumn of his final year. A cold snap arrived early, dusting the high peaks with a layer of snow that did not melt. The air grew sharp and clean. One morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the frost-covered plains in hues of rose and gold, Chief separated himself from the herd. There was no distress, no panic. He gave a soft, low grunt, a sound of farewell, and began to walk. His destination was unmistakable. With a slow, unwavering gait, he headed east, toward Boulder Creek. The herd understood. As one, they stopped their grazing and turned to watch him go. Then, led by the strong bull who had long been his second in command, they began to follow, keeping a respectful distance of 100 yards. It was not a pursuit. It was a final solemn procession, an entire society honoring its king's last pilgrimage. In the warmth of the monitoring station, Anya, Reynolds, and Ben watched the scene unfold on the main screen. The drones broadcast a silent, crystal-clear image of the slow journey. Ben began to instinctively list protocols for an animal in decline, but Reynolds placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," the director said, his voice thick with emotion. "We do nothing. We don't interfere. We don't analyze. We just watch. We bear witness. This is his way. This is the final lesson of the accord, knowing when to simply be still and show respect." They watched for hours as Chief made his way to the clearing, the silent herd following like a shadow. He did not falter. He walked to the old cottonwood tree, its leaves now a brilliant, dying gold, and he lay down in the grass, his body facing the warmth of the rising sun. He was in the exact spot where he had reunited with Arthur, the ground where his friend's ashes had nourished the earth. As the sun climbed higher, he laid his great head down and closed his eyes, the slow, rhythmic plume of his breath mingling with the crisp autumn air, and then, peacefully, ceasing altogether. Below him, the herd stood watch, a silent, living monument to the king who had taught them everything. Asterisk. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.